Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Research Out Loud, Met Fellows Present. My name is William Gasway, and on behalf of academic and professional programs of the Education Department of the Met, I'm thrilled this afternoon to be your host of the second in a series of 16 panel discussions featuring this year's Met Fellows. Thank you for joining us. For those of you joining us for the first time, it might be helpful to provide a little background on today's program. In September of last year, the Metropolitan Museum of Art welcomed 62 fellows from 16 countries to take part in the 2021-22 fellowship program. For the duration of their 12-month residencies, our 21 postdoctoral and 41 predoctoral fellows have been given special access to the museum's collection of art, museum staff, libraries, research facilities, and laboratories. Working across the fields of art history, conservation and the material sciences, anthropology, critical race theory, and museum studies, they are provided the time, space, and support needed to complete their book manuscripts, doctoral dissertations, academic articles, conservation training, and scientific investigations. And this series is a chance for all of you to learn what fruits their labors have produced so far this year. Before we begin today's event, I want to take this opportunity to express unequivocally that the Met stands in honor of the first inhabitants of the land on which the museum is presently located, the original homeland of the Lenape people. We recognize their forced removal from this territory and acknowledge the continued significance of these lands for Lenape nations past and present, and we pay our respects to past, present, and emerging Lenape leaders. The Met also gives our respect to the people of Seneca Village, a community of Black property owners who were removed from their land and whose village was destroyed in the creation of Central Park. We recognize the involuntary sacrifice that these families and individuals made and honor Seneca Village's legacy. As a special note, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Met's Fellowship Program. To commemorate this momentous occasion, the annual spring series has been relaunched this year as Research Out Loud Met Fellows Present. Beginning today and continuing through May 25th, this virtual series will feature 58 fellows presenting cross-cultural and trans-historical connections rooted in a deep engagement with our collection. Following these online presentations, we will bring the series to a crescendo on May 26th, when we invite all of you, our friends, colleagues, and community, to delve into a series of in-person, on-site events that will expand upon the themes discussed here through gallery talks, a short film screening, a demonstration of 3D reconstructions of ancient Egyptian tombs, and a musical performance by a fellow and her trio, among other exciting events. You can find more details about these activities in our program, which you can download using the link that my colleague Samara Chaudhry will share in the chat. Please join us then. At this point, panelists, if you would please join me on screen, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce you to our attendees. Alisa Victoria Prince is a scholar, artist, and curator of visual arts and artifacts of the Black diaspora, and a doctoral candidate in visual and cultural studies at the University of Rochester. Alisa's work focuses on the history of photography, the roles of race and gender in identity construction, and artistic forms of resistance. Currently, she is researching Black vernacular photography and investigating the spaces in which it is found. This year, she jointly holds the Henry Luce American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship in American Art and the Chesterdale Fellowship in the Department of Photographs here at the Met. And her presentation today is titled Portraits of People Never Met. Dr. Jonathan Michael Square is Assistant Professor of Black Visual Culture at Parsons School of Design and currently the Gerald and Mary Ellen Ritter Memorial Fund Fellow. Dr. Square also founded and runs the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. Today, Jonathan will be presenting his talk, The People v. Peter Sawali, or The Misadventures of Mary Jones. Finally, Dr. Wendy Grossman is an independent scholar and curator affiliated with the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and completed her MA and PhD in art history at the University of Maryland, College Park. She has lectured internationally and published widely in exhibition catalogs, academic journals, and anthologies on the history of photography, intersections between non-Western and Western art, Dada, Surrealism, and the artist Man Ray. Her scholarship on Adrienne Fidelin, the subject of her fellowship project, first brought this long overlooked figure to international attention through her essay co-authored with Salah E. Patterson in the catalog accompanying the exhibition La Modèle Noire de Jericho à Matisse at Musée d'Orsay in 2019. Today, she presents her talk, Travails of the Traveling Hats from the Congo to the Met. And we are very happy to be joined by our discussant today, Denise Morel, Associate Curator of 19th and 20th Century Art in the Office of the Director, whom I will introduce more fully at the beginning of our panel discussion. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. A few quick notes about the format of today's event. Each of the 3 talks today is 20 minutes in length and will be followed by a panel discussion with our fellows and discussant. I encourage everyone attending to submit any questions you have in the Q&A at the bottom center of your screens. And with that, we'll get underway with our first presentation. Alisa Prince, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Please take it away. The rest of us will turn off our cameras.
I would first like to express my gratitude to William, Marcy, and Zamara of Academic and Professional Programs for all of their organizing of the Research Out Loud presentations, as well as Jeff Rosenheim and the entirety of the Department of Photographs, who have been tremendously generous and helpful throughout the course of my research, and my fellow panelists and all of my fellow fellows who contribute so much to this intellectual community. In 2015, the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired 59 gelatin silver photo booth images of Black middle-class people that were created during the mid-20th century. In 2017, the museum acquired 194 more studio portraits of Black people. These 2 groups formed the pool of images from which 180 would be selected for the African-American portraits photographs from the 1940s and 1950s exhibition, a show that was curated by Jeff Rosenheim, the Joyce Frank Menschel curator in charge of the Department of Photographs, and on view in 2018. This body of portraits depicts Black folks posing and presenting a vision of themselves before the lens. Sitters are well dressed and often smiling. Many of the photographs depict pairs embracing one another, and numerous photographs of soldiers signal to the specific post-war moment in which they were made. Each photograph is a memento, if not made for the sitters themselves, then likely with the recipient in mind. The vernacular photographs in the African-American Portraits collection were created to be self-presentations of one's identity and not necessarily conceptualized by their sitters or makers as artworks. And yet each sitter is unknown. I recognize the beauty of the Black sitters shown in the collection, and I admit my own excitement in viewing them, but a just critique of the ethics of viewing them must acknowledge that they were never meant for me or likely any of us to see them. The process of exiting personal collections morphs these objects. Their arrival at the museum in particular marks another shift, almost as if given the status of artworks where viewers need only imagination, not relation or information to interpret them. Without greater context of the lives of these sitters, these types of photographs on the walls of the museum are co-opted in service of new functions. Today, I would like to explore that process, to contemplate how these photographs are read in the home and at the museum, to unpack the visual content, both photographic and inscribed, of a photographic object, to unpack how the visual content of a photographic object interacts with the anonymity of its sitters, and to consider how a sitter's seriality might question how much we can learn of a person from a singular vernacular portrait. Photographers would often situate themselves in bustling locations in hopes of capturing the merriment of everyday life. Sites like Beale Street in downtown Memphis, Tennessee, where the the Daisy Studio, one of only 2 known studios within this collection, was located. Examples of the studio are shown in the bottom 2 corners on this slide. While some of such studios were of decent proportions, with various backdrops from which to choose, others were small makeshift studios, which we can sometimes distinguish by their shallower depth of field and the closer crop of their sitters. The photograph in the center, or the center top row here, depicts the narrow walls of one portrait space. These photographs were made on waterproof direct positive paper that allowed the studio practitioners who made them to produce rich, detailed images in minutes. However, because this process does not use film, there are no negatives. Each photograph is one of a kind and cannot be duplicated. This indicates the extent to which these images are severed from their origins, which is an indispensable element of the process through which their sitters became anonymous, and this occurred prior to them entering the Met's collection. Moreover, as a result of this process, the subject matter that is printed is an inverted image of that which was before the lens, as seen here on the left with the sitter's US Navy cap. Thus, we know of images such as this one on the right, that the backdrop was inverted when painted in order to read correctly in the photograph. This illustrates just one of the ways in which sitters must suspend reality before the lens in order to create a more legible likeness. The mass production of this photographic paper for the military during World War II resulted in its excess. It grew popular throughout the United States because it was widely available and affordable, especially in the post-war era. Magazines such as The Billboard, which proclaimed itself the world's foremost amusement weekly, regularly included merchandise and advertisements for direct positive photo equipment throughout the 1940s. Notably, the magazine also ran advertisements for minstrel show equipment, as seen here on the left in a posting from T.S. Denison and Company, a company renowned for its creation of minstrel plays and song catalogs that would proliferate minstrelsy for decades. Although the popularity of minstrel shows was already on the decline by the time of this 1942 advertisement, it is important to contextualize how these histories overlap. As Black people were having these studio portraits made and presenting a heavily self-determined version of ourselves, we were also simultaneously haunted by racist practices of minstrelsy that mocked and degraded our very existence. Black vernacular photography, found primarily in family homes or personal collections, comprise what I refer to as the domestic archive. I maintain that interactions with the domestic archive by individuals, families, and communities foments a sense of conviction behind their identity, as well as their participation in that identity's construction. The ritual of looking that is intrinsic to these forms of imagery inside the domestic sphere activates the photograph as a site of identity development for its insiders, that is, the sitter, the relatives, friends, heirs, etc. Historian Dinah Ramey Berry's conceptualization of soul value offers a useful framework with which to think about Black vernacular photography, and domestic archives in particular. Soul value is cultivated distinctly by and for Black people. It is self-worth in a world that was not built to acknowledge it. Rooted in the Atlantic slave trade, it provides Black people with an understanding of our lives and ourselves outside of racism. Photography, I argue, is one crucial modality through which we experience and develop soul value. The photograph has been a vessel with which Black families pass on soul value and foster self-worth in younger generations, even after the death of the subjects or the holders of the images. Amidst social structures that quash Black subjectivity, the permanence of soul value is accentuated by the fact that the soul exists through life and death. Visual artifacts such as those that were included in the African American Portraits show, wherein Black subjects emit beauty in life, self-expression, powerfully attest to the soul value in photography. I would like to shift gears now and begin to unpack how soul value is altered when these kinds of images are reconstrued, far removed from the home, and now located at the mat. Whereas soul value foments imagination rooted in a personal connection, I would like to consider the nature of imagination for visitors of the museum, where the sitters are functionally anonymous. It is imperative to note that the sitters of these photographs were rendered anonymous prior to their arrival at the museum. Nevertheless, viewers inevitably distort the identities of these sitters for better or for worse. Operating within the realm of the unknown, what one invents when they view these photographs is only bound by the limits of their own imagination. Inventions which are determined by the viewer's desires, even their needs. Anonymized persons cannot grant permission, their communication is strictly visual, and they cannot affirm or disavow projections onto them. Thus, there is something deeply intrusive about viewing private images without the sitter's consent, and indeed, part of the pleasure that these photographs evoke is rooted in that intrusiveness. For non-Black viewers in particular, these photographs allow a racially motivated gaze into Black domesticity. Most of the sitters in the African American Portraits show appeared only once within the collection. One man, Mel D. Walker, stands out. There are 8 photographs of him. In the entirety of the museum's collection, Mel D is pictured in 5 different outfits and before 2 different backdrops, which suggests that being photographed was a regular practice for him. We can imagine that some of his photographs may have been shared with family, friends, or a love interest. Others may have been kept for himself. Taken together, while it may seem counterintuitive to highlight a person who's, I've skipped a line. Taken together, these photographs exemplify the nuanced, at times theatrical possibilities before the lens. While it may seem counterintuitive to highlight a person who is named in order to speak about anonymity, As a series, these photographs challenge and enrich the fixed view of a singular photograph might lead us to have about an unknown sitter's identity. In one photograph, the man stands just left of center with his chin perfectly square with the floor. On the backside of the image is his name, Mel D. Walker, written in the blue ink of a ballpoint pen. Mel D looks directly at the camera lens with a phlegmatic gaze that seems to look through viewers rather than at them. He wears layered t-shirts, a plain white one beneath a feather stripe that is styled with a halfway popped collar. Behind him, a painted backdrop depicts a partial archway leading to a faded landscape of trees and perhaps a stream in the bottom right corner. Reflecting the studio flash, his skin glistens and contrasts its smooth texture with the curls and kinks of his elevated and neatly coiffed hair. In a second image of the same photo shoot, he's presented with his side part shown more clearly. This time, Mel D is positioned with his head tilted downward and eyes looking up at the lens. Here he appears more conscious and perhaps cautious of being imaged. A third photograph before this backdrop repeats that pose. He bows his head slightly with his eyes looking up at the camera, but here he appears more calm and earnest, frozen in an extended anticipation of the close of the shutter. In this photograph, Mel D sports a woven straw fedora adorned with the pleated oval patterned band, a marker of late 1940s fashion. Another subset of this group of Mel D's images introduces a second backdrop. Here we see a painted window split into thirds with long ovals inscribed into each section. The hazy scene outside seems to be a body of water with a mountain on the far side of it, opposite Mel D. A scalloped curtain with a fringe peeking into the top of the frame adds dimension to the artifice. There are 3 photographs from this day in the Met's collection. 2 of the photographs in this group show him wearing brown glasses, another clue as to when the photograph was made, as this style of glasses was invented in 1947. Mel D appears to have been engaged in conversation in these images. At the opening of his mouth, his tongue is pressed into his teeth and his eyes seem distracted. With his slanted shoulders in a second image, in the center here, Mel D maintains a vague sense of inattentiveness. He appears aware that the camera lens into which he looks, but this frame reads as if disaffected by the image-making process. In a third image from this imaging session, his glasses are removed. Unlike the other 2 photographs from this day, where he appears engaged in speech, he now looks withdrawn. Still looking into the camera with eyes no longer obstructed by glare, his expression is reticent and melancholic. Of the 5 sessions of photographs represented in the museum's collection, on this day, Mel D seems the least present. This group of 3 photographs alone would characterize him as distracted, mean, and reluctant to be photographed. But the other 5 photographs evidence that he was invested in his image. Of the 8 photographs, Mel D is portrayed with another person in one. The top of each of their heads is tilted inward and touching the other. Mel D is on the left with his shoulders slightly overlapping that of the other sitter. The 2 are tightly framed within the confines of the studio backdrop. Their touch suggests a closeness between the 2 sitters, though their relation is unknown, perhaps father and son or 2 brothers. The back of the photograph only reads Mel D. I'm suggesting that the significance of this photograph lies not in the sitter's relation, but in Mel D's recognition that that relation is a piece of him. In this small sample of 8 photographs, 7 might suggest that his definition of self was lone, centering solely his own appearance. This photograph illuminates Mel D's keen awareness of insensitivity to a sense of self outside of his own form. More than any other photograph, Mel D's commitments to fashion are made apparent in the one shown here. Mel D dons a tricolored woven blazer atop a dress shirt patterned with intricately designed octagons, and his brow line glasses make another appearance. His hair is more slick in his image, and he has introduced a faint pencil mustache into the image. Even with a modest facial expression, he exudes confidence and appears pleased with his garb and himself. It is as if all of his experimentation before the lens culminated here, although these photographs are not marked chronologically. Wendy may have been working in the studio to find the perfect presentation of himself, self-editing between each pose of the shutter. His mission may have been to see himself in different ways, to learn what flattered him, of which angles and accessories made him look best, or perhaps he viewed himself in multitudes through an amalgamation of images. Moreover, he may have been drawn to the studio to catalog his ever-evolving sense of self. On their own, these photographs might read as a brief encounter with the camera, where Wendy sat for his image and carried on about his life. Reading them together, however, develops our sense that this young man was invested in his appearance and practiced regular image making. He experimented with and refined his look with each shot. To quote Rosenheim, curator of the African American Portraits Show, pictures tell us something powerful about the camera's role in our society and in issues of identity. He adds, how do you become the person you want to be? That is a question every portrait can ask. I ruminate on this group of photographs because it is important to acknowledge that within the vast realm of found photography, where sitters are overwhelmingly anonymous, you are likely to encounter an individual only once. We may then invent a version of their identity based merely on one photograph of them. More violently, we may not grant them the kind of deeper selfhood we witness when we watch Wendy toy with his appearance and composure before the camera. This group of 8 photographs still could not do justice to the full life and ever-developing identity of Wendy Walker, but it does serve as a reminder that while a standalone image has the power to fix an idea of its contents in the mind of its viewer, that idea is by no means complete, or is by no means complete, even as it may signify its own completeness. We see 8 versions of Wendy: stolid, brooding, self-possessed, restless, preoccupied, pensive, dispirited, reserved. There is no telling what Wendy felt represents him best. And perhaps he committed to being photographed so frequently because he knew that there are myriad parts of himself. Within the domestic archive, photographic objects operate within a web of exchanges. Among Black families, I've described such exchanges as being about soul value, fostering a sense of one's identity, self-worth, and heritage. Consider how Wendy is inscribed on the back of each of these photographs. It is to function as an identifier, signifying Wendy Walker himself, yet it only functions as such for those who already know or know of Wendy. At the Met, between anonymous sitters and their viewers, such inscriptions refer us back to the photograph itself rather than a person. In this way, vernacular portraits, even those of people we have never met, maintain uniquely grounded but never static identities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alisa. That was wonderful. That was Alisa Prince, Chester Dale Fellow in Department of Photographs, presenting her talk, Portraits of People Never Met. Next, we have Dr. Jonathan Michael Square, presenting The People v. Peter Sawali, or The Misadventures of Mary Jones. Jonathan.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I want to start off, like Alisa, by offering some words of gratitude. I'm thankful for Samara, William, and Marcy, and many people behind the scenes who you can't see right now who helped organize this event. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, Alisa and Wendy, 2 scholars who I admire greatly. And also, it's an honor to have this conversation moderated by Denise Morel, who I'm a big fan of. So it's an honor and pleasure to be here. I'm super excited to share my work with you all. I am going to share my screen. Okay. Today, I'm presenting a chapter that's in progress, and I've spent the last few months as a fellow in the Costume Institute thinking through an understudied figure named Mary Jones. But before I do so, I want to talk about just some of my work in general that I've been doing in the Costume Institute. So I had the honor and pleasure to contribute to the current anthology show, the current Costume Institute show that's up right now in the American Wing. And some of my research was featured in one of the case studies. So another chapter that I'm currently working on a book manuscript. And there's a chapter in that book manuscript on two Brooks Brothers coats that were worn by enslaved men. And in the current show right now, there's one of those coats is on display. And what I really like about what the curatorial team in the Costume Institute did is that they displayed the coat, one of the coats that was worn by an enslaved man alongside a Brooks Brothers coat that was worn by Abraham Lincoln, and they're displayed alongside each other. And they were manufactured around the same time. So it was really a treat to see my research featured in the current Costume Institute show. Also, I have another chapter in my book manuscript that's on head wraps worn by free and enslaved women. And there's a really curious object in the Costume Institute's collection. This is a head wrap. It was donated by Maria P. Jones, who is a descendant of the Ludlow clan. If anyone's from New York here, you've probably heard that name Ludlow before. It's a very sort of old New York family. There are also several enslavers within the Ludlow family. So extraordinarily wealthy family. And in 1911, this woman named Maria P. James, she was a descendant of the Ludlows, donated a number of like objects, furniture, clothing, accessories that has ended up in the Costume Institute's collection. And so we rightly so associate head wraps with African and Afro-diasporic fashion, but there was a trend in the early 19th century for elite white women to wear head wraps. And that's a dynamic that I study in the third chapter of my book. I'm actually going to put an article in the chat that I wrote for Small X, which is a journal of Caribbean studies, on this dynamic. When I first started this research, I was mainly interested in Black women's sartorial agency. And in the process of doing this research, I stumbled upon this trend of white women wearing these head wraps. So this head wrap is an example of that sort of early example of cultural appropriation. But what I want to focus on today is the second chapter in my book, which focuses on Mary Jones, who was a Black trans sex worker who worked in New York in the early 19th century. And I spend the second chapter unpacking her self-fashioning. And she's a really extraordinary figure because there isn't much information about the lives of trans people in the 19th century and earlier. And in the case of Mary Jones, we have a number of documents, newspaper articles, a court case, this drawing of her to sort of reconstruct details of her life. So I start off the chapter by just thinking about early African-American self-portraiture, or better, the lack of early African-American self-portraiture. So on the left, you see this silhouette of Moses Williams, who was a famous silhouette cutter in the early 19th century in Boston. And of course, on the right, we have Phyllis Wheatley, one of the first published African-Americans. And I think about the dearth of self-portraits of African-Americans. And of course, the lithograph of Phyllis Wheatley isn't a self-portraiture, but there's some evidence that it was created by a man of African descent. And the reason I focus on the dearth of African-American self-portraiture at the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century is because I want to show what was at stake for people of African descent in terms of like self-representation. Because a little bit later in the chapter, I look at images like this. This is by George Cruikshank, and it's a depiction of an abolitionist club. And as you can see, there's a number of negative stereotypes that are attached to Blackness in this image, whether it's disorderly behavior, savagery, lasciviousness, slovenly dress. And so, you know, most images of Black people, and in this case, this is in the UK, so there's a transatlantic dynamic to this research, which I'll talk about later in my talk. But there was a lot at stake in terms of like representations of people of African descent, whether it was in the UK or the United States. This image had a large impact on a man named Edward William Clay. Edward William Clay was born in Philadelphia in 1799 to the wealthy Clay family, which they have no relation to Henry Clay, by the way. He was directly influenced by Cruikshank's Life in London series, which he encountered during his time in Europe in the mid-1820s. Edward William Clay was unusual in that he was of means. Most lithographers were either rather poor or middle class. He came from a wealthy family. In the late 1820s and into the 1830s, he published a Life in Philadelphia series, which in large part focuses on caricatured scenes of African-American life in Philadelphia. In 1837, he moved to New York City. And in 1837, he would also create the etching of Mary Jones, who's the figure that's the focus of the second chapter of my book manuscript. So just for more context, I spent some time thinking about some of the images in the Life in Philadelphia series. And this is a really telling image. It's a Black woman in a retail space requesting flesh-colored stockings. And so many of the depictions of African Americans in this series, actually most of them, they're sort of wearing sort of over-the-top, very extravagant fashion. And the gag of this particular image is that, you know, why would a Black woman want to have flesh-colored stockings? Isn't it silly? Isn't it crazy? So a lot of these cartoons sort of lampoon African Americans' consumptive power, or at least their desire for consumptive power. Later in the 1830s, Edward William Clay would create another series that sort of leaned into anxieties about miscegenation. And this particular image is titled The Amalgamation Waltz. And one thing that I've noted in this series of cartoons that he created was that there was a particular anxiety about Black men being with white women. Because of course we know white men being with Black women has a long history. You know, to a certain extent it was accepted, but what was outrageous was the idea of Black men being with white women. And of course, this doesn't reflect the reality of African American life. This sort of reflects white anxieties about, one, miscegenation, or what they refer to as amalgamation. But it also is just a telling. The 1830s, I think, is often ignored, but it was a pivotal moment. There was an increasingly free Black population in the Northeast and also in certain cities in Europe. And so you see a proliferation. One, there's a proliferation of print culture in the early 19th century. And you see a proliferation of sort of racist images of people of African descent, sort of reflecting white anxieties about this increasingly free Black population. So that in part explains why the lithograph of Mary Jones was created, putting it in context. But in the chapter, I also look at several newspaper articles in an 1836 court case in which she was convicted of larceny. And I have to give a shout out to the Digital Transgender Archive because that online archive has many of the articles written about Mary Jones. And on the image on the right is a screenshot of the 1836 court case in which she's convicted of larceny. So as a fellow in the Costume Institute, I've tried to reconstruct details of her dress using objects from their permanent collection. While referencing this drawing of her, I studied the sharp-waisted, sloping shoulder silhouette of her 1830s gowns. I used Sawali's fashion body as an archive. The court case and numerous newspaper accounts are ancillary sources in my analysis in this chapter. So essentially, even though I do spend some time on textual analysis, like I read the newspaper articles in the court case closely. And the court case is particularly important because it's a firsthand testimony from Mary Jones herself. But what I argue in the chapter is that, these sources are ultimately created by a queerphobic criminal justice system. So there's a lot of biases in them. But if we focus on how Mary Jones styled herself, we're able to sort of get past sort of the problems, the biases, the prejudice of these kinds of documents. So I spent a lot more time doing a close visual analysis of her self-fashioning. I hadn't really thought about 1830s dress prior to starting this chapter. I think a lot about Western dress around the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century, what we might call Regency dress, or more recently Bridgerton dress, sort of that empire-waisted, sort of flowy, gauzy white gowns that we associate with turn of the 18th century into the 19th century. So it was really nice spending some time thinking about 1830s dress. And luckily enough, the Costume Institute has a plethora of gowns from the 1830s. If the Costume Institute decided to recreate Mary Jones' look from head to toe, they have all the objects, all the garments one would need to do so. In 1830s, silhouettes have a very particular look, which I learned, sort of very broad shouldered and sloping shouldered, sort of a large billowing silhouette made with layers of petticoats, but then cinched in at the waist. So I spent a lot of time just thinking about that particular silhouette and how Mary Jones participated in fashion in this way. And what really strikes me about this cartoon of Mary Jones is that, as I showed you in previous slides, Edward William Clay wasn't against sort of grotesque caricatures of African Americans. In fact, most of his images of African Americans are actually negative in that way. So what strikes me about this image of Mary Jones is that it's actually quite flattering. What's unflattering is, of course, the moniker that she's given, the man monster. But the image itself is actually quite flattering. And she's dressed very much on trend for the 1830s. And so there's a certain, and I'm searching for the word to describe this. Ambivalence is not the word that I'm looking for. So despite all the negative descriptions in newspaper articles and the negative nickname that she's given, man monster, the actual image itself is quite flattering, if not beautiful. One thing that I learned is 1830s dress, there was one of the ideal silhouettes was sort of a puffy, sort of voluminous sleeve. And the way that was accomplished is with sleeve puffs. So the Costume Institute has a number of sleeve puffs in their collection, and I was able to handle some of them. As I said, the ideal silhouette was sort of voluminous and billowing, whether it's in the sleeves or the bottom half of the body, but the waist was cinched in, and it was cinched in usually with a silk ribbon and a buckle to create sort of a bell-shaped silhouette. Also in the image of Mary Jones from 1836, she carried she carries a man's billfold in one hand, sort of alluding to the fact that she apparently had a history of theft. But in her right hand, she carries what's referred to as a reticule. A reticule is a sort of small, dainty bag that women in the 1830s carried. They were quite small, so they weren't particularly practical. It was more of a fashion item than sort of a utilitarian tote. But, you know, when I did scheduled my visit to see these objects in the Costume Institute collection, I was a little, I thought, you know, there'd be a handful of like a few objects to look at, but there's a lot in the Costume Institute collection from the 1830s. It's kind of a mother lode. So it was really a treat being able to see all these objects. Just to wrap up, we know frustratingly little about the lives of trans people in the 19th century, and I would say, of course, earlier. But we're able to use garments from the period to recreate how Jones may have wanted to present herself to the world, as opposed to using documents from court cases or newspapers or criminal justice records, etc. So I'm going to end by just sharing my socials. As William said in my introduction, I'm very active on social media. I share a lot of my research findings online, so feel free to give me a follow. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was wonderful. That was Dr. Jonathan Square presenting The People v. Peter Sawali, or The Misadventures of Mary Jones. Next, we have Dr. Wendy Grossman, who will be presenting Travails of the Traveling Hats from the Congo to the Met. Wendy, please take it away.
Fine, there we go. Thank you, William. I also would like to begin my presentation with a note of gratitude, mirroring the comments of my two fellow presenters, of the amazing support and wonderful experience of working with Samara, Marcy, and William, and how supportive the whole education team has been, and what a wonderful opportunity it's been to work with you. I also want to thank my fellows, both on this panel and in the entire cohort. What an interesting group of fabulous and exciting people working and engaging in such a diverse amount of activities. Fellows I hope to continue relationships with. In particular, I'd like to give my thanks to my inaugural fellow in the office of the director's office, Carol McFarlane, my partner in crime, and also to my host as a fellow here, Denise Morel, whose both scholarship and personal support has been really instrumental in my entire process of bringing this story that I'm going to bring together now to fruition. So thank you, everyone, and here we go. So in 1974, a unique bequest of 47 prestige caps and headdresses from Central Africa's Congo River Basin was made to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute. This bequest came from Lily Daché, the French-American milliner whose inventive designs dominated the American and French fashion scene from the 1930s to the 1950s. Tracing the trajectory of their long and circuitous journey from the Congo to the Met, as I do here, reveals how these masterfully created objects spawned a provocative revolution in Western hat design, found their way into the surrealist orbit, and provided the vehicle through which a then anonymous Black model transgressed an intransigent color barrier in the American fashion industry before they landed in the museum. Each piece in the diverse range of objects around which this story evolves was crafted and worn by members of the Kuba and other groups united under the Bashongo Kingdom in modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. These objects exemplify the rich variety of creative regalia that mark the status and initiation of members into various title-holding societies in the region. Nearly all headwear in the Cuba Confederacy are based upon a type of simple domed cap worn on the crown of the head and held in place with a metal pin. Men receive these small raffia hats called laket mission upon completion of an initiation process that signal their transformation into mature members of Cuba society. The more elaborate the combination of feathers, shells, animal skins, beads, etc., adorning such unique creations, the higher the status of the society member. The most elaborate forms of headdresses are reserved for kings and chiefs, constituting an essential component of royal regalia. The prestige caps and headdresses in this particular collection in the Met date from the late 19th to the early 20th century. Removed by force or trade from the territory brutally colonized by Belgium's King Leopold II in the 19th century, they were sold on the European art market. They are witness to the fact that creative practices of artists and artisans persisted even in the face of the region's brutal colonization and the genocidal plundering of its rich natural resources. Obscure references to the display of these objects in the 1931 International Colonial Exhibition in Paris are the first trace of their presence in Europe. And here I'm showing you on the left what you might think you are in the Congo. This is actually the Belgian Congo Pavilion at the International Colonial Exposition in Paris in 1931. And what I'm showing you here on the right is in fact the bequest from Lily Daché, in which she notes that their provenance comes from the colonial exhibition in Paris. And also one might want to note in her bequest their headdresses from a generic Africa, and the entire list is actually only by style, what the medium and the components of there are. There's no context specific to their stories. The colonial exhibition was a major endeavor organized by the French government to justify its colonizing activities at a time in which the rationale for imperialist exhibition was coming under increasing critical scrutiny. It promoted a colonial modern aesthetic as a fashionable expression of the nation's efforts to impose cultural hegemony. The diverse headwear that originally served as utilitarian forms of personal adornment, status, and ceremonial dress were transformed in the Western context into coveted art and fashion objects, emblematic of the thirst for Black culture that flourished in interwar Europe. This phenomenon conflated under the undifferentiated and problematic rubric of l'art nègre, the material culture, creative production, and bodies of peoples from the African continent and its diaspora. 6 years after the colonial exposition, the headdresses appeared in the vitrines of the Gallery Charles Retton in an exhibition titled La Mode au Congo. Retton, the preeminent dealer in the indigenous arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas in Paris in the interwar period, was an avid collector of African headwear, a predilection likely influenced by growing up with a father who was a milliner. By the time he opened the Moto Congo exhibition on April 29th, 1937, he had amassed an inventory of 52 such objects. Installation views of the Moto Congo exhibition and press clippings from Retton's personal archives are instructive for understanding both the gallery's approach toward the objects and the show's reception. In one of the gallery's main vitrines, seen here, the objects were deftly installed on individual stands at varying heights in a rhythmic pattern, presented as singular objects worthy of aesthetic reverence. This conventional installation contrasted with the unusual display of the headdresses in a neighboring vitrine. Playfully hung from wire or string at varying heights, they take on the haunting appearance of disembodied flying objects imbued with the Dada surrealist zeitgeist. This iconoclastic installation was perhaps Retton's nod to such avant-garde influences. For example, it evokes scenes from Hans Richter's famous 1928 Dada and Surrealist inflected short film, Ghosts Before Breakfast. In both their film and the installation, Richter and Raton each experimented with unexpected modes of presentation in provocative ways. Raton was no stranger to the avant-garde, having built relationships with Surrealist leaders André Breton and Paul Eluard while organizing the 1931 auction of their extensive collections of art from Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. 5 years after that auction, Breton's gallery would gain renown for hosting the 1936 exhibition of Surrealist objects. Breton's iconoclastic installation that randomly intermingled over 200 eclectic and incongruous items. This provocative laboratory aimed to upset conventional categories of knowledge, bringing to the fore transcultural explorations that came to characterize Surrealist endeavors. But in contrast to this widely celebrated exhibition of Surrealist objects, the Motokongo exhibition Raton mounted 1 year later in these same vitrines has largely flown under the radar. A closer examination of its history, as revealed here, suggests it played an important role in the process through which African material culture was assimilated into the world of high fashion. Within days of the show's opening on April 29th, 1937, articles in the French press and beyond celebrated the fashionable nature of the unusual exhibition and the elegance of the objects featured. A particular article in the weekly French journal Mariam by Surrealist poet Paul Eluard was punctuated with floating images of several headdresses. The text concluded, "The exposition of headdresses at the Charles Raton galleries in Paris will surely have a happy influence on fashion." The reception of the exhibition affirms Eluard's prediction and reflects the success of Raton's strategy to target the fashion world in promoting the show as being, quote, "a very Parisian exhibition." As the exhibition's press release announced in advance, the show, quote, "will not fail to be of great interest to those who attentively follow fashion questions and will no doubt inspire them." And indeed, Lily Daché responded in kind. As recounted and illustrated in a Life magazine article published on September 13th, 1937, she acquired the collection of headdresses 2 months after Raton's exhibition closed at the end of May, paying $2,500 for the lot. On September 13th, the article announced she will open her new 10-story building on Manhattan's East Side with an exhibition of what threatens to become the African style in hats this fall and winter. The anonymously penned Life magazine article titled "Africa's Belgian Congo Sets the Style in Hats for American Women" shifts the focus from the novel headdresses to the practice of the milliner who acquired the objects for her own creative purposes. Notably, Daché put her new acquisitions to immediate use, mounting them on the foyer wall of her penthouse apartment in the newly completed building. More significantly, Daché grew upon these objects to create a body of colonial-inspired decorative forms that captured the imagination of the European and American fashion worlds, as reflected in photographs by Life photographer Alfred Eisenstadt. Several examples of Daché's designs, such as the one seen here, can be found today in the Met's Costume Institute. In this shift from the direct appropriation of foreign goods to an assimilation of design elements and materials, Daché's creations translated a colonial modern aesthetic into Western haute couture. Where does fashion come from? This was the question posed in the title of a photo essay in the French daily paper, Ce Soir. The article answered, "A French milliner based in New York has just caused a sensation she had the daring idea of simply taking inspiration from the hat styles worn by the natives of the Congo. And here is how she adapted them. A seemingly less enthusiastic commentary about this trend is manifest in the lampooning tone of an illustrated article in the German weekly Choral, with the derisive headline asking if perhaps New York is located not on the Hudson, but on the Congo. The cartoon accompanying the reproductions of Einstein's photographs leaves no doubt about the racist stereotypes in which the editors of the publication in Nazi Germany were trafficking. Unraveling the journey of these objects and their reception exposes racial attitudes about Africa endemic to France's contemporaneous so-called civilizing mission, the insidious pretense for pillaging the continent for its own material gains. Notions of savagery and racist caricatures, as projected in ads for Daché's new hats on the left and in related articles on the right, echo the complex reception of African art in all forms in the West in the 19th and early 20th century, and the cultural hierarchies that remained ingrained for generations to come. 2 days after the publication of the Life magazine article, an issue of Harper's Bazaar dedicated to the complete story of the Paris openings featured a 2-page spread titled "The Bashongo of Africa Sends His Hats to Paris." The text is an English translation of Eluard's lyrical essay that had appeared in May in the French journal Marianne to promote the exhibition at Rattan's gallery at the time. In this presentation, the text is framed by black and white photographs by Man Ray of models sporting several headdresses from the exhibition, now identified as being in Daché's collection. Both the poet's effusive prose, with its romanticized notions of the Bushongo, or members of the Congo Kingdom, as pioneers for Parisian fashion, and Man Ray's photographic images take on new meanings in this context. The photographs in Harper's Bazaar were selected from Man Ray's Moda Congo portfolio, a series of 35 images in which various models posed wearing selected headdresses from Daché's collection. Among his models are some of the same female artists, poets, and writers who collaborated elsewhere in Man Ray's inventive photographing process. Although unidentified at the time, these include Maynard Oppenheim, Alice Rohan, and Consuelo de Saint-Exupéry. But the model most frequently appearing in this series is Adrienne Fidelin, the Guadeloupean dancer and model who had become Man Ray's partner and muse in 1935. In contrast with the relatively static poses of the white models, the 9 compositions in which Fidelin appears reveal a far more animated and exoticized participant. Indeed, it is impossible to escape the distinctive manner in which she is dressed, accessorized, and seductively posed that lend an exoticized tone to her representation. The tiger's tooth necklace, ivory bangle, and bared breasts are cultural markers underscoring her racial otherness. These and other photographs of her by Man Ray appear to have served as portfolio building opportunities for the modeling career she hoped to establish. And indeed, Fidelin's big break came when a selection of Man Ray's photographs from this 35 print series was featured in the September 15th issue of Harper's Bazaar. In the 2-page spread, Fidelin's image is reproduced full page across the spread from 3 smaller reproductions of other models from the Moda Congo project. She is literally and figuratively set apart from the similarly crowned white models on the opposing page. She is staged to evoke the fashionable, quote, African Negro, extolled in the article's headline and in Eluard's text. Reduced to a fanciful projection of difference, her identity is assimilated into a homogenizing notion of Blackness. Ironically, it is arguably this paradoxical treatment of Fidelin that led to the publication of the image, even in the face of intransigent racial boundaries in the fashion industry. In the guise of a Congolese, this Guadeloupean woman unwittingly became the first Black model to be featured on the pages of a major American fashion magazine. Epitomized in this transatlantic triangulation of objects and individuals is the chance encounter of incongruous elements to create new meanings that animated the surrealist ethos in its intersection with the world of fashion. Nonetheless, Fiddlin has, until recently, remained a figure on the outer margins of histories of fashion, surrealism, and even in the canon of man-ray subjects. The tide, however, is changing. 2 weeks ago, almost 20 years after Fiddlin passed away in obscurity in the south of France, she appeared in the New York Times series of obituaries of previously overlooked individuals. Although she is again showcased in the same photograph from Man Ray's Moda Congo series that had been reproduced in Harper's Bazaar, she is no longer an anonymous figure illustrating a fantasy narrative, but rather the subject of her own story. And the Congolese headdress she is wearing, incidental to this new narrative, has itself taken on a new life as an object of its own right, housed today in one of the most prestigious museum collections in the world. As we revisit the storied collection of these Congolese headdresses today, we have the opportunity to rethink the histories of these objects in more prismatic ways. Their long journey from the Congo to the Met and all the stops in between reveals the syncretic nature of modern fashion and the multifaceted roles played in its development by different African cultures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Wendy, if I may ask you to put down your screen share, please.
Okay, there we go.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to invite all of the panelists back on screen at this point. And to say thank you for the wonderful set of presentations. Excuse me while I shut the window on the noisy street below. It really is an amazing slate of papers. So thank you all for everything that you've poured into these. It's absolutely fascinating topic, completely regrettable at times and extraordinary. So thank you for sharing this. And I hope that it sparks a rich conversation. I want to, before introducing our discussant, I just want to encourage everyone to go ahead and please submit your questions using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screens. I'll give you, a few moments to collect your thoughts, and but please do submit your questions that you'd like to ask of our speakers, and I'll be happy to relay those for you. I'd like to introduce now our discussant, Denise Morel, who is Associate Curator of 19th and 20th Century Art in the Office of the Director. Denise, who joined the Met in January 2020, received her PhD in art history from Columbia University. She was previously the Ford Foundation postdoctoral research scholar at the Wallach Art Gallery, Columbia University, where she was the curator of the exhibition Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet and Matisse to Today, and a co-curator of its expansion at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, La Modèle Noire de Jéricho à Matisse. Denise previously received an MBA from the Harvard Business School and a BS from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and worked in finance and consulting. She has taught art history at Columbia University in New York and in Paris. Welcome, Denise. So happy you could be with us. We're honored.
Thank you, William. And I want to first echo in my case, profuse thanks to the three panelists, Alisa and Jonathan and Wendy, for the meticulous attention, research, documentation, reflection that you've given to your presentation of these the histories of these three individuals who are compelling in their own right as individuals, but also, I believe, representative, emblematic of some broader presence in the societies from which in which they lived, in a way that I think can be instructive and enriching to the histories of art going forward. You're talking about individuals from disparate periods and locales, but this shared project, this project that I think that we all share of excavating these histories that bring to the fore the marginalized, the obliterated, the presences that are often invisible, even though in plain view. I also had some thoughts about the title itself, Fashioning Black Subjectivity, and the question of subjectivity, subject position. You've all talked about this kind of conflation of the representation of sitters by the maker, the author, the artist, the photographer, and the way in which those images, even though they often do convey a documentary reading, a sense of this is the truth about this individual, are in fact, these representations are often in fact reflections of the artist's own point of view, their anxieties, their misunderstanding, their biases as it relates to the actual reality of their sitters' lived experience. And so therefore, this tension between, when we think about subjectivity, the tension between the representation by the maker and the attempts at self-representation by the sitter, both in the images that we are discussing today, but in their own lives and in their own work. I think this is a challenge for all of us, for us as historians, to try to think about how to foreground as we think about subjectivity, subject position, the ways in which the subject, him or herself, manifest their own view of their being in their attire, in their pose, in the direction of their gaze, etc. So I think about Alisa when she talked about the representation through the entire collection of photographs that she referenced, but specifically Melby Walker, of this presence, talk about a presence that's visible, invisible, even though in plain view, the representation of the Black middle class, the representation of Black populations who go into photographic studios and make images or commission, pose for images, often a series of images over time in different modes of pose, attire, affect. This type of effort at self-representation, self-definition. And then Mary Jones, as Jonathan discussed, the specifics of her attire and the difference between the way she presented herself and the way that she was represented in popular culture. And of course, Wendy's transatlantic story of Adrienne Vidalin at the very heart of the world of surrealist photography between Man Ray and his circle, including Picasso and numerous others. So as I just think about, this is kind of a meditation, a reflection out loud as to the subjects, the questions that come to mind as I read and listened to your presentations. And as we await, I think we are beginning to have some questions come in, but if I could just go back to this question of the tension between the seemingly documentary representation of the sitter's subjectivity in comparison with the manifest or assumed implicated efforts at self-styling, self-representation by the sitter, him or herself. How do we pull the position, the subject position of the sitter from the sitter's point of view into the way that we write these histories, into the way that we present these histories to the public, and try to dislodge this notion that the image presented by the maker is the definitive image of that person's subject position. So if any of you have any thoughts about how steps you're taking, strategies you're using as you present these histories, these profiles, how do we create this kind of instability around the idea that the maker's image is the definitive image, and infuse in our analyses the a regard for, a respect for, and an attempt to understand the self-styling, the modes of self-representation by the sitters themselves.
I can get us started. For me, it's sort of a process of being mindful of the endless possibilities when I'm doing my research. Being aware of how my own acts of critical fabulation are invented, like by me, and completely or largely rooted in what I find to be important. And that's part of why I wanted to bring Melody Walker's images to the audience today, to think about how if we look at any one of these images on their own, we might have a different idea about them. But when we look at them as a whole, we see that there's so many different possibilities for just what photograph could have been made that day. Whether it be through his dress, his pose, his expression, aspects like that of his portraits sort of tell us that there's always, like with every second in the portrait studio, there's the possibility for a new self to be presented. So I'd say in my work, I just sort of try to routinely come back to that idea that none of these photographs are necessarily definitive, but rather that how we're viewing them is rooted in our own sort of imaginative processes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Alisa, can I jump in there and ask you a question? I was really interested in the fact that your photographs are identified as unknown sitter, and then you identify the sitter. And I wonder about the thought process behind, I mean, yeah, they're not known, but you know who they are. So why are you using that way to identify them?
That's a great question. Thank you. As they're cataloged within the museum's collection, they're listed as unknown. So in honoring that, I kept the unknown sitter line there. And I also find that part of my thinking there was just sort of like wanting to repeat that unknown aspect of Melody Walker, to be mindful that everything I'm saying about him, it doesn't really mean that I know him. He's still an unknown. I know his name. I know what he looks like. But I think that sort of reinforcing unknown sitter just speaks to what I'm trying to get at here, where he's still functionally anonymous. I don't know any details about him.
I found it interesting to look at with all of these presentations, the single image has to be looked at in the context of the series that you presented, showing the trajectory and the change over time of, pose and direction of the gaze and even attire. And we're still surmising, even with that serial information, we're still surmising what his intentionality, his interiority, his subject position was. But I still think we're getting closer, or maybe I should say, I hope that we're getting closer to being able to capture some aspect of that subject position by insisting on the seriality, on the series, showing the trajectory, showing the change over time, rather than choosing one image and trying to make that an icon in isolation of everything else.
That's very important. And I want to note that particularly with these sorts of photographs that would be in the domestic archive, especially during this time, you would have different ones, you have multiples. And
Jonathan, just coming back to this, the point that Wendy made. I mean, I was just really thinking as I listened to you speaking about Mary Jones, how the groves, I'm sorry, clay etching was based on this racist stereotyping that he was influenced by coming across from the UK, and found that he had to, for whatever reason, he chose to make before he made this relatively sensitized representation of Mary Jones. And I think about Wendy discussing the way that stereotypes, colonialist stereotypes about Africa were projected onto Adrienne Vidalin. She was of African descent, but she was from Guadeloupe. And
a French citizen.
Yeah, exactly. She's not an immigrant in the French system, context. She's a French citizen, Guadeloupe being a département of France. So this kind of, how do we separate out the othering, which, as Jonathan pointed out, it often emanates from the anxieties, the lack of knowledge, the biases of the maker, and get at the subject position of the sitter themselves. That's something that I'm always attempting to do. How do you separate these things out? Jonathan, you're talking about your book chapter. Are you addressing the tension between the two as you profile Mary Jones?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like what you're describing, that relationship between the subject of an image and the creator of an image is actually quite central to my research question in that chapter. You know, just being a scholar of visual culture and thinking about representations of people of African descent and African Americans from the 18th century up into the present day, it almost seems like there's almost like an American love affair with like distorting Black expressive culture.
Mm-hmm.
And like, how do people of African descent in the US and just generally throughout the diaspora, how do they sort of respond to those negative images, those negative depictions, that this distortion of Blackness? And, you know, as a fashion scholar, I use fashion.
Yes.
My methodology is to, you know, until very recently, to the last half of the 20th century, like most African Americans didn't have widespread access to, you know, the government or the press or sometimes the church, but they had access to their own bodies. Mm-hmm. They had full control, or sometimes full control, over their self-fashioning. Mm-hmm. So that's often what I rely on to sort of get at something that's less tainted by white control or white gaze, is by looking at self-fashioning.
By a white maker's notion of who this person is. One of the most compelling frames in, I think it was Alisa's presentation, was the ad from a magazine showing, on the one hand, the minstrelsy shows that I guess they were advertising for actors or advertising the shows, but then the ad from the photography studio that people could access to go in and make photographs as mementos, as mementos of important family and community events, without necessarily thinking that these are ultimately going to come into the public domain by being an artwork in the collection of museums like the Metropolitan Museum. So these acts of resistance, self-styling, in acts of doing to overcome the broad popular perception that is often reflected in these artists' representations of these figures. William, I could go into another line of questioning, but I do see that we have a few in the chat. Do you want to pull some of that in at this point?
Absolutely, I think that's a great idea. And please, to the audience, please continue to submit questions as you like. First question is for Jonathan. It reads, Clay, the lithographer who depicted Mary Jones, seems to have been an avid observer and imaginer of quote unquote forbidden social life. His family's wealth may have enabled him to pursue his interests under the respectable guise of a lithographer/artist. Is there any evidence that he knew Peter/Mary? Also interesting how the name Mary Jones resembles that of the 70s Marsha Johnston, an ordinary American name taken by an extraordinary individual.
Yeah, those are two great questions. Yeah, I think I'll tackle the second part of the question first, because I don't do this in my research, but I would love for someone to have a project on thinking about naming conventions amongst enslaved people and their descendants as a form of self-fashioning. Because I've thought about that name, Mary Jones, and what, by choosing the name Mary Jones, what was she trying to communicate? And, if I had to guess, it's a name that might have been associated with respectability. It's also a name that's easy to pronounce for an English speaker. What's also really interesting about Mary Jones is that she went by a number of aliases. Another name that she went by was Miss Ophelia. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I would probably say the same thing about Marsha P. Johnson. Like it's a name that might be associated with a certain degree of like respectability or domesticity, which is something that, femininity, which is something that's often denied female identified individuals. But thinking about the second part of your the attendee's question, if they actually encountered each other or knew each other, I don't know for certain. I certainly know that Clay knew of Mary Jones, and I imagine based on newspaper articles that I've read about Mary Jones that she was an important figure, like a renowned figure in New York City in the early 19th century, just based on the kind of language that was used in these newspaper articles. Things like Mary Jones strikes again, Mary Jones seen sidling down the sidewalk again. So it sounds like she was someone, if you lived in New York in the early 19th century, you probably had encountered Mary Jones before, but I don't know if they actually met face to face. So.
That question about naming conventions, it brings up a very minor thing for me, but riding the bus every day in Harlem, the automated voice comes on and says, next stop is Fred Douglass Boulevard. I said, no one calls it Fred Douglass. who in their right mind calls it Fred Douglass? There was another question for Alisa. Was Mel D perhaps the photo assistant with a photo or two taken each day to calibrate the camera? Another related question from the same attendee, would you have a chance to study the reflections in the glasses lenses with a microscope to discover details of the studio or who might be taking the photos?
Thank you, Larry. Those are great questions. To speak to the first one, I have considered the possibility that Mel D is a photographer or perhaps an assistant. I don't know. I think that speaks to sort of what this body of portraits does. We don't really know who's there to make a memento for their family, who's working, who's doing it for whichever reasons. And to speak to the second question about the glasses, I wasn't able to see any distinguishing details in any of the photographs where he's wearing frames, unfortunately.
Alisa, can I ask you an annoying question?
Sure.
I'm going to ask you the kind of question a historian's going to ask, but have you gone to Ancestry.com and looked under people with the name Mel D. Walker?
Yes. So in doing this research, I became very curious about who Mel D. Walker may be. And there's sort of two parts to the answer. Yes, I have looked into him. I've found phone numbers and possibly family members. However, I think that identifying him in particular is sort of separate from what I'm getting at in this larger body of images and how we view and understand these vernacular portraits of Black folks. So while I could do that work for every Black sitter we see in these images, I think it's a different kind of thing than what I'm getting at here. But valuable work and work that I am somewhat interested in.
I'm always following the transcriptions of our presentations to make sure that they're accurate, and they are not. So just to be clear, Alisa was not presenting on Melvi, Melbourne, or the Spice Girl Mel B. All of those were possibilities if you were following just the transcription. Jonathan, I had a question. I believe I found the correct object in our collection. You mentioned the head wrap, what you, I believe, referred to in your own terminology as a head wrap, but on the website is listed as an evening turban. Is that the piece that, is that the correct piece? I can pop that in the chat for everyone to take a look. But I wonder, was this clearly it was a conscious choice to call it a head wrap as opposed to an evening turban, which does seem like an unfortunate choice, or perhaps it's actually quite revealing of the context in which it was worn. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
And William, can I just make sure that we know which, okay, I see the link now. It's not the Madras head wrap, is it? The Madras plaid, yes, it is. It is, okay. I'm interested in hearing what Jonathan has to say about that as well.
Yeah, it's a really curious object for a number of reasons. One thing that I'm trying to understand is that it's dated as 1823, which is a very specific date. It didn't say 1820s or 1830s, 1823 specifically, which I think is really fascinating. But also to go to your question about terminology, why it's called a turban, it was donated with 2 other turbans that actually look like turbans in like the traditional sense of the turban or turbans. There was a trend in the early 19th century, and if there are any fashion scholars here, you know what I'm talking about, that was more inspired by the Orient or the Middle East that sort of looked like what we might consider a turban. So alongside this trend of like wearing madras, what I call head wraps or kerchiefs, there was a simultaneous or contemporaneous trend of wearing sort of Middle Eastern, Oriental inspired turbans. And so I think, and that's something that I've noticed in my research in this period, there's just a lot of confusion about the origins of fashion items. Like anything that's not European sort of gets, anything that's other sort of gets described as being like Oriental or Middle Eastern or from the Orient. And so even when I think about, even though the term blackamoor is older, like it's from the Renaissance, the term blackamoor, but the same thing is kind of happening there. Like there's a collapse, there's a confusion between someone who might be from sub-Saharan Africa and someone who might be from North Africa. And there's a similar thing happening here where like this trend of wearing madras, people aren't sure where it comes from, so it gets labeled as being so Oriental.
Now, one thing that I can add here, just if I can introduce some of my own research on this type of image, I was really thrilled to hear that we have one in the collection, but having spent a lot of time looking at French Caribbean representations of French Caribbean women by French artists, by white French artists in the 19th century, a marker and an emblem of being Martiniquez would be to wear what the French called a foulard. That would be distinctive from a turban being something that's kind of piled on top of the head, in comparison with this, which is sort of down across the forehead, tied or arranged at the back. But specifically, the fact that it is a madras plaid fabric. Now, this doesn't look exactly like the madras plaid that you see in Manet and a number of other 19th century artists. And one thing that is different about it is the color tonalities. The standard colors were kind of a rose, pink, blue or black and white. But I just can't believe there isn't some conflation, some sourcing of this traditional French Caribbean foulard or head wrap that was definitely present in popular culture and in fine art representations of French Caribbean women from the early 19th century all the way up through today. Did you find any connections between that lineage and this particular object?
Absolutely. And one thing that Maria P. James said when she donated the items to the Met is that they were acquired in France. So this is from France.
Okay.
And that's one thing that I've noticed too, like in my research, it's more of a French thing. It's less Anglo. So you see it in metropolitan France, you see it in Réunion, you see it in the Caribbean, you see it in Louisiana, like places that were part of the like wider Francophone world. And you see it from the late 18th century, like the 1890s, all the way up to the 1920s. Of course, in the Caribbean, it's just part of folkloric dress wearing a madras head wrap.
Yes, yes. Well, speaking of head wraps, I wanted to segue going back to Wendy's presentation of Adrienne Vidalin, and we're looking at her wearing headdresses, wearing the Cuba headdresses that later influenced Lily Daché. But we also, Wendy, some of the research that has emanated from your look at the headdresses has been her own, sort of the way that her own hair has been styled by makers, artists, not just Man Ray, but one of your more recent discoveries has had to do with Picasso and certain paintings that he may have made that seem to resonate with the way that Adrienne Vidalin would have presented herself without the accoutrement of the Congolese hats or headdresses. And you're muted.
Thank you. Would it be possible for me to share my screen for a second to show something that Denise is referring to? Let me
go ahead.
Go ahead and let's see.
While you're doing that, I would love to pop in the chat a link to an article that you appeared in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago on this very topic for those who are interested.
Here we go. Okay. You see this?
Yes.
Okay. So part of my research, as Denise has pointed out, and Denise, again, I'm so grateful for your support through this whole process. We've been on quite a journey together, as I done more research, I'm following up on the headdresses. That's actually where this all started 20 years ago. As I came across these photographs, and I'm like, what are these? What's the story behind them? How did and who's this person that nobody knows anything about? And as I started to do more research and finding out more about Adrienne Vidalin and her time that she spent, not just with Man Ray, but Lee Miller and Roland Penrose and Voles and the different number of people who had photographed her. So I'm really interested in Alisa and Jonathan talking a little bit later, these questions of representation, because ironically, even though we know something about her story, what we know mostly is how she's represented, through the plethora of photographs. But I kept looking, and in the summer of 37, she was with Man Ray and Pablo Picasso and Dora Maar and Nushel Ward and Paul Edouard and Lee Miller and Roland Penrose, this whole little elite avant-garde circle in the south of France. And Picasso's paintings of the portraits of the other women, Lee Miller, Dora Maar, and Nushel Ward, are very well known. They've been exhibited. They, are all part of this whole story of this summer of 37. And I kept saying, there's no way that she wasn't one of the people who Picasso would have painted. In fact, if I go to the next picture here, you can see how she was obviously very part of this intimate circle of people. That's her sitting on Picasso on the dock. Dora doesn't look too happy about that, but it's still something that, I basically said there has to be a painting of her. He had to have painted her. And the one thing I learned, and not being a Picasso scholar, was that Picasso didn't just date his work by year, but by date. So I could actually narrow down everything that he painted during the period of time, the 2-month period overlapping in August and September, when they were out in the south of France together. And I saw this painting and I immediately knew it was her. And in part, because I knew this Man Ray photograph in terms of the composition, the compositional elements, the pose, but also looking at her hair. And this is to Denise's question. The first thing about looking at the hair and the way that the face is portrayed, there's no parallel in Picasso's work. It's true, it's not representational and there's not a one-to-one, and his photographs are abstracted and almost caricatured. But to me, there was clearly a woman of color involved in the subject matter that inspired this portrait, and then to figure out like the timing and all the context around it. But so it was indeed, that was the starting point, and able to go back and to identify her. So this is one of my current projects that have overlap with the story of Adrienne Fidelin, which is very central to my research.
And Wendy, I would point out that I think one of the things that really reinforces the sense that this painting could be based on this photograph of Adrienne Fidelin is the detailing of this wooden, would you describe it as a
washboard? It's a washboard.
It is an actual washboard, okay, and the patterning around the torso in the painting. And I think, Wendy, the other thing is that you established that one print of this Fidelin photograph was inscribed by Man Ray as related somehow to Picasso. Is that correct?
Correct. Actually, was meant to put that in there. He actually wrote at the bottom next to his signature the letters ARR, which have been interpreted to mean engagement, but he wrote ARR Picasso. And Picasso had 2 prints, vintage prints in his collection. So, you know, that it's one of these kind of moments where all the pieces seemed, everything falls together with the exception of the fact that we can't find the painting. But other than that, it's coming together. It's, you know, there's been a lot of, finding a story of a person that nobody knew anything about, and finding out that, you know, she was hidden in plain sight to Denise's point. She was right there.
And I think that loops back, William, you were probably going to focus on a very interesting question that's come in for Alisa. So I'll let you ask that, but I just want to make the comment then in my own work and listening to all of your presentations, this idea of seizing on seemingly the most minute detail of representation, of depiction in the image, and just trying to figure out what can be deduced, learned about that particular detail can be the way that identities become unlocked, or an individual is placed within a broader community. So I'm all for looking at every single detail and seeing what can be done about it. But William, do you want to put this question to Alisa that has come into the chat?
Absolutely, thank you. The question, Alisa, is, might you consider the Melody sequence of portraits in a juxtaposition to Warhol's use of photo booth and portrait sequences of Jean-Michel Basquiat and others?
Thank you for that question. I'll start by saying that the research I presented here today is a part of my dissertation, where I'm looking at how these photographs from the domestic archive are moving in different spaces, how they function in the home, within private collections, and for sale on the market, in the museum, which is what I presented today. And then I conclude my dissertation with this final chapter on how artists interact with the domestic archive. However, my focus there is on Black artists, including Carrie Mae Weems, Dawoud Bey, and Tyler Mitchell. So I look there at how they're using the aesthetics of the domestic archive, whether it be in the sort of Snapchat casualness that Carrie Mae Weems might exemplify in her series Family Portraits, which is the first series that she sort of like presented as a professional photographer. I also look at Dawoud Bey, who created portraits that using a really exciting film called Type 55 Polaroid film, which might be worth connecting to Warhol's photographs of Jean-Michel Basquiat. But there, Dawoud Bey would give his sitters an instant print of their portrait, and then keep the negative that he would take into the art world. So I am interested in sort of how the art world interacts with this domestic realm of photography, but I haven't yet written or considered Warhol's series. If that covers what you're asking.
Speaking of that question of juxtaposing these older works, these depictions of Melody with, Warhol or Basquiat, I wonder, coming back to Jonathan for a minute, you talked about the fact that so little is known about trans communities in the early mid 19th century when these portraits of or portrayals of Mary Jones were made. Have you seen any resonances either in the imagery itself or in this manifest resolve on her part to somehow, through her self-styling, through her fashion, as captured in the etching, make some representation of her own sense of herself. Do you see any parallels in contemporary or more recent art that you can relate to these 1830s etchings as a
Oh,
way
wow.
to depict the trans presence in society and in art in general?
That's a question I haven't really thought about. I mean, I can think of a few artists that sort of deal with trans identities in their work.
Mhm.
What comes off the top of my head is like Mickalene Thomas. Sometimes has trans individuals in her works. Also Arthur Jaffa, who's a visual artist and filmmaker, also did a work in which he's not trans, but he portrayed Mary Jones in one of his works. So there are a few artists that are also Tourmaline, who's another trans artist whose work is also included in the Afrofuturist period room that's up right now at the Met. Also sort of treats trans identities in her work. So there are a number of contemporary artists that are sort of dealing with similar issues. But I actually want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier that I thought was really good about the details, because this chapter really sort of like, I really sink my teeth into details. It's because of the lack of sources. And in all honesty, I mean, it's a lot of sources considering that there's so few sources on Black trans individuals in the 19th century and earlier. So actually it's a lot of sources, but to write an entire chapter, it's not a lot of sources. It's like 8 or 9 small newspaper articles, a court case of 3 to 4 pages, and a lithograph. And that's all I'm basing the chapter on. So I really have to sink my teeth into those details, like really dig into, like do really close readings of the newspaper articles, really sort of zero in on like the oral testimonies of Mary Jones, really look at that lithograph, pick each element of her dress apart. So that really resonated with me, what you said about the devil being in the details.
Absolutely. And I have had the experience that if you look closely at one detail, it can lead to other information that is more expansive. For instance, the work that I was doing on the Black model Laura, who posed 4 times for Manet, including most famously in Olympia. And all we have about her is an annotation in one of his studio carnet or notebooks, Law, Très Belle Négresse, her address, okay, which was within walking distance of his studio. But to me, that gave her a concrete reality. She wasn't totally a fiction, constructed imagination of Manet. He was arguably, and certainly in a racially fraught way, depicting some observed reality. And so then I started looking at photography. It kind of it's what led me to Google or to search in the French library archives for other representations of, Négresse, Belle Négresse, whatever. And that led to the whole archive of photography that I'd not been aware of before. And I could see that some of these women were attired in a way very similar to the way that Manet depicted Laure. And some of them had biographies, had histories that were discoverable without a whole lot of work. So you can take a fragment to learn more about the individual, but also about what that individual represents in terms of the lived experience in that particular situation. The other comment I'll make, and this is a little bit of but you think about museums and what we display here at the Met, And I often think as I walk through the Greek and Roman galleries about how many of the monumental sculptures, the Roman emperors and so forth, when you read the labels and look closely, you see that they were not brought to the museum, fully formed. They were fragments, often shards, literally shards of marble or sandstone or whatever. And images from the period, as well as imaginations, were used to reconstruct these figures and to present them to us as we see them today. So I think it is a well-established part of art historical inquiry to piece together fragments, acknowledge the gaps, as Met labels for a Greek sculpture will do. You'll have a diagram showing what's discovered and what's made, to fill in the gaps, but just use that to construct narratives, disclose what you're doing, but put it out there. It can be meaningful and it can lead to other information emerging. So I encourage following up on these seemingly minute details.
And I think one thing that unites all of our research, including you, Denise, is that I think another name for this panel could be hiding in plain sight. Because it's not like we're going to like obscure, like hidden archives to find this information. We're at the Met. Like all this information is sort of like at very well-established institutions and archives. You just need to like ask different questions of these sources.
To have the curiosity about the image and not just about the artist. I think art history can be overly focused on, describing images in terms of the genius, the creativity of the artist, rather than looking at the subject, looking at the image itself. What does the image represent? What could it represent outside the artist's studio? So much of contemporary engagement with historical images of people of color in art history, like Mickalene Thomas, is to, or Elizabeth Columba would be another artist who's worked in this vein recently, Titus Kaphar, pull a trope, a representational trope from art history, Baroque, Renaissance, 19th century, France, American, place it in a contemporary setting that has some way, that in some way tries to imagine this subject outside the way that the subject is presented by the artist. What can we learn about the lived experience of someone who looked like this person? And then how can we reimagine that? Maybe using some of the critical fabulation that Saidiya Hartman has deployed in her readings of art history and of history. But these are all well-established practices in art history, and there's no reason for us not to embrace them. We don't have to have these fully formed stories, and you're absolutely right. The curiosity to look is 60 to 70% of the game, because often information is sitting there right on the surface, it's just been ignored historically because the question that would lead to this information hasn't been asked.
Such an interesting and unexpected counterpoint to my own research in the ancient Americas. What I love about studying ancient art is precisely the complete absence of biography. Now, it's all not to say that we're not discovering more and more the actual names of artists. They are very few. They're scant examples of that, but there are more and more that we're discovering, thanks in large part to the decipherment of texts from that period that we just simply couldn't read before. But what that represents for me is a liberation of the image and my approach to it, in the sense that if you have the biography to grapple with, you absolutely need to. You're compelled to. It's your responsibility to grapple with that. But the fact that I'm not necessarily able to recover that about so much of ancient art, I'm talking about things created 2,000 years ago, for me is precisely why it's so liberating to study it, in the sense of I get to talk about big themes that matter to all people ever who have made art. And that's that's love and death and legacy and honor and betrayal and all of that comes to bear. If you are willing to be receptive to it, you can see compositional structure, how it might reflect attention in the broader society. You can learn, the images that these people chose to depict, the images that they were forced to depict, maybe as prisoners turned, artists for the conqueror. We can do isotopic analysis of their teeth even and find out what their diets were. I mean, it's an amazing range of material that you can discover about them, just not always their names or who their, certainly not who their dealers were or what they met with their therapist about or who their girlfriends were. I mean, these materials are lost to us, but there's still an amazing amount of information about their lives and what they thought and how they conducted themselves that you're still able to recover. And I love that sort of tension between trying to capture as much of that previously unknown and thought to be lost information through the art that they choose to create, the images that they bring into, that they manifest for us even today. It's not an exact parallel, but it's something that I've never been struck by. I've always thought of that as a divide between ancient and modern, the access to biography in the modern era. So I applaud you all for recovering what you can and not giving up on, just thinking that just will remain lost and inaccessible to us. There are so many tools that you can use to make up for what is not known. And then also you're doing the archival work to recover what is known and has just been lost track of.
For sure. I realize we may be kind of running out of time now, but I wanted to put a question to Wendy, Alisa, and Jonathan in terms of next steps with these profiles of individuals, named individuals in all three cases that you have constructed, excavated, and brought forward. How do these narratives get baked into the broader narratives that art history constructs around these periods, so that the Black middle class that Alisa was referring to, the people who sought, were the subjects, were the customers, the clients of Black vernacular photographers, or the trans community, or the populations of color within the French world. How do we get these people who are, and people as representations of a broader community who are present, but invisible because of historical marginalization? What are specific steps that you're taking in your work to bake your narratives into the overall histories of these periods and societies?
I can jump into that. It's one of the sort of exciting things that are starting to pieces fall together. I've argued for a long time that Addie's story is best told in context. So there's a great story there. I mean, I've got an exhibition proposal. It's floating around about the summer of 1937. If we can really tell that story, and people are, I know when I start talking to this, people I've seen that photograph. Who's that person, right? I mean, because the story itself is supposedly really well known. So, that is certainly one. I was asked recently by a filmmaker about how can we tell her story, and he made a really interesting comment when I said, well, we don't have diaries. We don't have a lot of, we have sort of anecdotal information from some of the people who were around there. We do have, like 500 photographs and different things that we can do, but mostly it's, again, my argument is let's make the story about all the other people who are around this community and just make sure that she's visible, she's present, she's up front and center. So.
Right. For example, she wasn't the only Black dancer model in 1930s France. There were dozens. There were hundreds, possibly, of whom several dozen have been photographed by well-known photographers as well. So there's a representation of something that's broader that I think is worth getting at. But I'm curious to know what Jonathan and Alisa are doing along this line of baking these narratives in.
I have two comments. One is in response to the conversation that we were having a little bit earlier about details. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I've had from this fellowship is to be more object focused.
Mm.
I am not an object focused scholar. I'm very much into like documents and archives. Like when I'm looking at an object, I really annoy people sometimes. I'm like yeah, the object, like show me the accession records. Who donated this? Like I want to see the documents behind the object and not the object itself. And like one thing I've learned doing this fellowship is like, no, actually there's important details in the actual object that you need to really like just think about and consider. But to answer your question that you're asking right now, I mean, there's a scholar who's working on a book right now. His name is Channing Gerald Joseph, and he's writing a book on William Dorsey Swan, who was a drag queen in Washington, D.C. in the late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So there's other scholars doing work on queer communities of color. But considering Mary Jones sort of pushes that genealogy even earlier to 200 years ago. One thing that really strikes me about Mary Jones is in the court case, she says that, my community accepts me. I dress like this in New York all the time at my own parties and in New Orleans also. And so there's a hint of like a sort of community that's accepting of trans identities in the early 19th century. And she's saying like, you white people, you're the problem. Like in my community, like no one has an issue with the way I dress. So one thing I'm trying to do is like think about or unpack queer communities of color in the early 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Alisa, any thoughts on what's next for you and your work on the photos that you've discussed?
I'd say sort of, as I'm thinking about this idea of focusing on details and what you can extract from them, I'm interested in just continuing to oscillate between the details that we see in these photographic objects and these like larger themes about Black people, about how we're imaged and where those images go and what they mean in all of these different spaces, and like kind of just keeping this like ever oscillating notion of where we can like make sort of broader statements and what that does. And of course, I'm interested in doing this in the James Vanderzee archive that the Met now has. So I'd say that's sort of next steps in my research, is bringing that sort of way of thinking about these photographs, these kinds of vernacular photographs of Black people, to the work that I do there.
Fantastic. I don't think I should go any further, William. I'm looking at the clock here, so over to you. With many thanks to all three panelists and to the Fellows Program overall for bringing this scholarship forward. I'm sure that many people who are watching this are seeing ideas that can be pulled into their own work. I will say that I'm certainly one of them. And I just hope that we collectively in these efforts of excavation and representation are going to be able to build these diverse narratives into the previously kind of monolithic voice of art history and make it more polyfocal, multivalent, multiple voices, bringing different perspectives to the way that we define these periods through art history.
I think it's a beautiful sentiment, and couldn't add anything more to that you haven't already said. And I just want to thank all the panelists. It really has been an honor to host your research, which is so insightful and incisive. Thank you for everything you've done to prepare for this and that you will continue to do in the months ahead at the Met. It's been such a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing what's next, as Denise said.
Thank you, William. Thank you.
So, before we all go, I just want to invite all of those in attendance today to join us tomorrow for the next session in our series on May 17th. In the morning, we have Embodied Practices, Making and Experiencing Art in Ancient Egypt and the Andes. And at 2 p.m., we have Word, Image, Material, New Frontiers in East Asian Art. These virtual events will continue through this week and on through Wednesday of next week. And we'll conclude with a day of in-person events on May 26th one of which will feature a short film that Wendy Grossman, one of our panelists today, will be featuring. She'll be showing that in front of the audience and then contextualizing it further through her through additional presentation there. So please do join us for that. The program includes all the information on that session. I hope you can be there. Looking forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you all again for being here.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Take care.